For more than 4 years, most of the fighting in the Russia-Ukraine war has taken place inside Ukraine. Russian cities continued their daily routines while the battlefield remained hundreds of kilometers away. But that reality is changing. Ukraine is now carrying out larger and more frequent long-range drone strikes deep inside Russia. Military bases, oil facilities, and strategic infrastructure are increasingly becoming targets. For many Russians, the war is no longer something they watch on television. It is starting to arrive closer to home. Over the past week, Ukraine launched one of its largest drone operations since the war began. Russian authorities reported intercepting hundreds of drones across multiple regions. Several strikes targeted areas around Saint Petersburg, Russia's second largest city and the hometown of President Vladimir Putin. Ukrainian officials said some attacks targeted military and naval facilities. The attacks also disrupted activity around Russia's flagship economic forum in St. Petersburg, one of the country's most important annual events. The message from Kyiv was clear: no part of Russia is completely beyond reach. Ukraine faces a difficult challenge on the battlefield. Russia still has larger resources and continues military operations along the front line. Instead of relying only on defensive operations, Ukraine is increasingly using long-range drones to strike targets deep inside Russian territory. The goal is simple. Ukraine wants to increase the cost of the war for Moscow. By targeting military assets, fuel infrastructure, and logistics networks, Kyiv hopes to pressure Russia and disrupt its ability to sustain military operations. This strategy is also designed to show Russians that the conflict is no longer confined to Ukraine. The Kremlin argues that these attacks represent a major escalation. Russian officials have accused Ukraine of carrying out what they describe as terrorist-style attacks against civilians and infrastructure. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov recently said the conflict has entered a different paradigm because of the growing number of strikes inside Russia. Moscow has used these attacks to justify new waves of missile and drone strikes against Ukrainian targets. As a result, both sides are expanding the conflict beyond the traditional front lines. One of the most important developments is psychological rather than military. For years, many Russians lived far from the battlefield. Now, residents in cities such as St. Petersburg are seeing air defense activity, hearing drone alerts, and facing temporary restrictions during attacks. Authorities have even urged people to stay indoors during some incidents. The attacks may not cause large-scale destruction, but they create uncertainty. And uncertainty can be powerful. It changes how people view a war that once seemed distant. The escalation comes at a time when diplomatic efforts are struggling. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy recently proposed direct talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Putin rejected the proposal and signaled that Russia would continue pursuing its military objectives. At the same time, Ukraine's European allies have continued discussions on military support and future security guarantees. Leaders from the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Ukraine met in London to coordinate their next steps. For now, diplomacy remains overshadowed by military action. The biggest question is whether these attacks will change Russia's calculations. So far, there is little evidence that drone strikes alone can force Moscow to alter its strategy. However, they do create new pressure. They force Russia to spend more resources on air defenses, protect critical infrastructure, and reassure its own population. At the same time, every Ukrainian strike inside Russia increases the risk of retaliation against Ukrainian cities. That creates a dangerous cycle. One side attacks, the other responds. Then, the conflict escalates again.